I should tell you that I was there for all of it. I have known the Duke of Carramore since we were boys at the same miserable school in the north, throwing mud at prefects and reading banned novels under our blankets. And I can tell you with absolute authority that he was not the sort of man who submitted to being managed. He had spent the better part of 33 years perfecting the art of getting his own way, in business, in Parliament, in the drawing rooms of London and Edinburgh, and half the great houses of the Highlands. He did not take instruction well. He especially did not take instruction from his grandmother. Which is precisely why I found the whole business so extraordinary to watch. It began, as so many remarkable things do, with a letter, a short one. 3 lines on his grandmother's particular cream stationery, with her seal pressed so deeply into the wax that you could feel the impression on the other side of the paper. I was sitting with Carramore in his study at Dunlevy Castle, a beautiful, cold room full of maps and horse portraits, and the particular smell of a fire that has been burning since November when he read it. His face did not move. His face rarely did. But his jaw tightened in the way it does when something has caught him off guard. "She's coming," he said. "Your grandmother's. In a fortnight, and she's bringing someone." He set the letter on the desk. "A companion, a Miss Elspeth Reed." He said the name the way a man might say a word he'd found written on the floor and had no explanation for. "Is that a person you know?" "It is not." I waited. Carramore never elaborated unless pressed, and pressing him was a particular sport that required patience and a high tolerance for long silences. "She is," he said at last, "the daughter of General Reed." I knew the name. Most people in England with any interest in military affairs knew the name, and not favorably. General Reed had been a distinguished soldier, a veteran of 3 campaigns, a man of considerable reputation, right up until the court inquiry 2 years prior, when it emerged that certain decisions made in the field had cost men their lives in ways that could not be attributed to the chaos of war. He had not been found guilty of anything that could be prosecuted. He had simply been found wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't forgive, in military or social circles. He had retired under the weight of it and died 6 months later, leaving behind a modest estate swallowed almost entirely by debts, and a daughter whom society had quietly decided was, by association, also suspect. "That Miss Reed," I said. "That Miss Reed," Carramore picked up his pen. "My grandmother appears to have employed her as a companion. She is bringing her here." "And this troubles you?" He looked at me with the expression he reserved for statements of exceptional redundancy. "I don't require trouble," he said. "I require quiet. I have the Morrison contracts to review. I have the Northern Tenancy accounts to finish before spring. I have 340 miles of fence line that the steward tells me need replacing. I do not require a young woman of contested social standing wandering through Dunlevy asking polite questions." "She may not ask questions," I said. "She may be very quiet." "My grandmother's companions are never quiet. My grandmother selects for personality." He was not wrong about that. The Dowager Duchess of Carramore, Lady Ainsley, as she was known outside the family, was a woman of formidable intelligence and absolutely no patience for insipidness. She was 81 years old, had buried a duke and 2 sons, had outlasted 2 wars and 1 financial panic, and had opinions about everything from the price of grain to the moral character of politicians that she delivered in a voice like a judge reading a sentence. She was also, I had always suspected, several moves ahead of everyone she spoke to. She collected people the way some women collect china, for their interest, their rarity, their particular quality of catching the light. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, in a traveling coach that looked as though it had survived the Crusades, attended by her customary army of hatboxes, and followed by a second, smaller carriage from which descended first a footman, and then a young woman I did not recognize. I say young. She was perhaps 25, perhaps a year or 2 more. She was not beautiful in the manner that word usually implied, not the powdered, polished kind of beauty that London produced for the marriage market. She was slim and straight-backed, with dark eyes that moved quickly around the courtyard, taking it all in with an attention that was not curiosity so much as habit, the habit of someone who has learned that environments matter and must be understood. Her dress was plain. Her bonnet was sensible. She carried her own bag without seeming to notice that this was remarkable. Carramore was standing at the top of the steps. I was standing beside him, having attached myself to this scene with the specific purpose of watching it unfold. His grandmother reached the top of the steps and kissed him once on each cheek with brisk efficiency. "You look thin," she said. "This house is cold. Why is this house cold? You can afford coal." She turned to me. "Lord Ashby, still trailing after him like a retriever, I see. Good, someone should." She swept inside. The young woman had reached the top of the steps. "Miss Reed," Carramore said. His voice was exactly neutral. "Your Grace," she curtsied with precision, rose and looked at him directly. Not boldly, not with any challenge in it, simply directly, as though she found it natural to look at a person when speaking to them. "Thank you for having me." "My grandmother arranged it," he said, which was entirely true and entirely graceless, and she received it without flinching. "So she did," Miss Reed said. "I won't be any trouble." And she followed the Dowager inside. Carramore looked at the space where she'd been standing. Then he turned and went inside himself, and I followed at a careful distance, already taking mental notes. The first week was, I will admit, not auspicious. Carramore retreated into his work with the thoroughness of a man digging a trench. He was at his desk before 7, emerged for dinner with a punctuality that was more logistical than social, and contributed to conversation the minimum quantity of words required by courtesy. He was not rude. He was simply sealed, the particular sealed quality that his grandmother had spent 30 years attempting to unlock, and that had, thus far, held. Miss Reed, for her part, was exactly what she'd said she would be. No trouble at all. She accompanied the Dowager on her morning walks, read to her in the afternoons, sat quietly at dinner and answered questions when addressed, and otherwise moved through Dunlevy with the careful self-possession of someone who has learned to take up exactly the amount of space she is given. Except in the library. I discovered this by accident on the 4th day. When I went to retrieve a volume I'd left on the windows the evening before and found her already there, standing at the far shelves, with 3 books open on the table beside her and a 4th in her hands, reading with the focused intensity of a person solving a problem. She looked up when I entered, and there was a moment, just a moment, where I caught on her face the expression of someone who has been somewhere private and has now been found there. "I beg your pardon," she said, and began closing books. "Don't," I said. "I only came for this." I retrieved my volume. "What are you reading?" She hesitated. Then, "Agricultural Survey Reports from the Northern Tenancies." I stopped. "I beg your pardon." She looked at the table. "Lady Ainsley said the estate runs Highland tenancy. My father dealt with similar land management challenges in the north during his posting and wrote extensively on drainage and yield in that climate. I was curious whether the local approach matched what he documented." A pause. "I have not touched anything I ought not to have. I found the surveys in the open shelves." "I know you haven't. I'm simply surprised." "That I read." The words came out with more edge than she'd intended, I think. She glanced away. "Forgive me." "That you read agricultural survey reports for leisure. It's unusual." She looked at the table. "My father valued precision. He taught me to read anything that illuminated a problem. I find it quieter than most other things at present." I thought about that for the rest of the day. I also thought about mentioning it to Carramore. He was, among his many preoccupations, in the midst of a genuine problem with the northern tenancy drainage, a persistent flooding issue in the lower fields that the steward had been trying to solve for 3 seasons without success. The surveys Miss Reed was reading were, in fact, directly relevant. I did not mention it to him. I was curious to see what would happen on its own. What happened was this. 8 days after Miss Reed's arrival, the Dowager Duchess, with the timing of a woman who does not believe in coincidence, announced at dinner that her knee was troubling her and that she would be spending the following day in her room. She said this with sublime serenity and then looked at no one in particular. Miss Reed did not blink. She helped the Dowager to her room with calm efficiency and returned to the dinner table to find herself, for the first time, seated across from Carramore without his grandmother's social mediation. He poured wine for her without being asked. This was, I noted, not his usual practice. "Are you settled into Dunlevy?" he said, which was, for Carramore, practically an oration. "Very much," she said. "The library is remarkable." "My grandfather's doing, he read everything." "So did mine." A pause. "The northern surveys and the estate records, the ones from the Edaram and Croft tenancies, are those fields still in use?" He looked up from his glass. "They are. Why?" They've been flooding in the lower thirds for some years, by the record. My father documented nearly identical flooding patterns in the Strathmore properties during his posting at Fort Cairn. He wrote a report on the drainage issue. She kept her voice even. I don't mean to presume. You've read the tenancy surveys. I have, not an apology, simply a statement. He looked at her for a moment, the long, measuring look that I recognized as Carramore's version of genuine interest, which resembled in all outward respects his version of distrust, and which only long acquaintance allowed one to distinguish between them. What did the Strathmore report recommend? He said. She told him. I will not reproduce the technical details here because they are not the point, but the point is that she spoke for nearly 10 minutes without repeating herself, without wandering from the subject, and without any of the apologetic hedging that most people inserted when speaking to Carramore about things they feared he might know better. She spoke as though the information were simply information, and he were simply a person who might find it useful. When she finished, she stopped. He said, the Edoram survey from 1849 mentions a secondary drainage channel that was closed. Do you know where it's noted? Page 43, she said, third paragraph. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. Carramore did nothing dramatically, but something shifted. They talked about drainage for another 20 minutes. I contributed nothing. I did not need to. After dinner, when Miss Reed had gone upstairs, Carramore stood at the fireplace with his glass and looked into the middle distance. She's read the surveys, he said, not quite to me. So it appears. Her father's Strathmore report, do you know if it was published? I've no idea. I'd like to read it. He turned his glass. She presented it clearly. She's a clear thinker, I said. It seems to run in the family. He didn't answer that, but he didn't disagree either. The following week proceeded differently. It was not that he sought her out. Carramore did not seek people out. It was one of his defining qualities. But he stopped sealing the library. He had previously taken his papers into his study and closed the door, in the manner of a man constructing a wall. Now he sometimes worked in the library in the mornings, and if Miss Reed was already there, he did not leave. He began, in the measured, lateral manner of a very private man, feeling his way towards something he doesn't quite have a name for yet, to address his remarks to the general air of the library rather than specifically to his papers, which is to say that he began, tentatively and almost invisibly, to talk. She was good at it, better than most. She listened the way attentive people listen, not waiting for her turn, but actually receiving what was said, and when she responded, she was precise and unafraid and occasionally quietly funny. Not the kind of funny that performs, the kind that simply notices things. On the third morning in the library, she said, apropos of his steward's latest letter, he writes unfortunately 4 times in one paragraph. That's the sign of a man who has run out of solutions but not yet run out of words. And Carramore almost smiled. Almost. His face made a movement in that direction. I witnessed this from the doorway, having arrived to retrieve yet another volume I had strategically left behind. I was developing a very useful habit of leaving books in the Dunlevy library. It was the Dowager, of course, who told me what she was doing. Or rather, she told me what she had already done, which is her preferred method of explanation. She said it one morning when I came to sit with her. Her knee had made a convenient recovery, but she was still taking her time about it. While Miss Reed was helping the steward cross-reference the Strathmore report against the Croft tenancy records, which she had taken on as a project with the calm purposefulness of someone who needed something to do and had found something worth doing. You knew she was exactly this, I said to Lady Ainslie, before you invited her. I knew she was precisely what he needed, she said, with the serenity of someone describing the weather. Clear-headed, self-possessed, not frightened of him, not trying to charm him. She set down her teacup. He spent 15 years in London drawing rooms being managed by women who wanted something from him. Position, money, the title, he can smell it from 50 yards, it makes him close up like a safe. She looked at me. She doesn't want anything from him except to be left alone to read. That is precisely why he can't leave her alone. I thought about that, and the drainage reports. Oh, those are genuine. Her father was a brilliant man who made one catastrophic error. She inherited the brilliance without the error and nowhere to put it. A pause. She needed a purpose. Dunlevy needed drainage. These things have a way of arranging themselves when one provides the right conditions. I looked at her. You are entirely without shame. I am entirely without patience, she corrected, for watching people who are perfectly suited to one another stand in separate rooms being sensible. She picked up her book. Go away, Ashby, let them get on with it. I went away, they got on with it. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not sudden. It could not have been. Carramore did not do sudden. It was more like watching a particular kind of stone in a very clear stream, something that looks fixed and permanent, slowly turning, moved by water that is patient and has no interest in hurrying. She did not push. She never pushed. She simply remained in the library at dinner, on the evenings when the Dowager retired early, and the three of us sat in the drawing room, and I played chess very slowly, and let the silences do the work I'd run out of books to engineer. He began to show her things, not ostentatiously, privately. He showed her the estate accounts, not asking for help, just laying them open on the table beside where she was sitting, in the way of a man who has had a thought and wants someone else to look at it. She looked. She noted where a column seemed to contradict the survey figures. He recalculated. She was right. He did not say so in words, but he brought the next month's accounts to the same table the following morning. He showed her the North Meadow, on a cold, bright morning when I had diplomatically remembered an entirely fictional prior engagement. He showed her where the flooding ran worst, and walked her along the line of the secondary drainage channel that was documented on page 43, third paragraph. I only know this because she told me that evening, matter-of-factly, that they'd identified where the channel had been blocked by a rockslide sometime around 1870, and that Carramore had told the steward to begin clearing it. He walked you through the lower fields, I said. For about 2 hours, she said. The mud was considerable. She was almost smiling when she said it. That evening at dinner, Carramore poured wine for her before she'd sat down, which was unprecedented, and he asked her, about her father's other work, not the drainage report but the other things, the wider body of thinking General Reed had produced over 30 years of careful observation. She told him. There was a great deal of it. He listened to all of it, and his face was not sealed. It was the last week of March. I found the Dowager in her sitting room the following morning, writing letters with the brisk efficiency she applied to everything. He's going to ask her to stay, I said. Lady Ainsley did not look up. He's going to ask her considerably more than that. You knew before any of it. I suspected, she said. I planned accordingly. She came as your companion. She came as a way of putting her in a room where my grandson would eventually stop being an idiot. The companion arrangement was the logistics of it. She set down her pen. She has no family to speak of, no income now that her father's estate is settled, and no prospects that society is currently inclined to offer her, because society is small-minded and her father's error has been made her inheritance. None of that is just. I find injustice tiresome. She picked up her pen again. And he has been alone at Dunlevy for 6 years, being competent and cold, and telling himself it's enough. It is not enough. I have watched it not be enough for 6 years, and I have declined to continue watching. I sat down across from her. He'll know you arranged it. Of course he will. And he won't mind. She looked at me over her spectacles. He will mind enormously and say nothing about it because the alternative is admitting that I was right. She returned to her letter. Go away, Ashby. He asked her that afternoon. I was not present. No one was present. This is Carramore. He waited until the house was quiet and the Dowager was asleep, and I had been encouraged, by a combination of mild hint and pointed silence at luncheon, to take my horse out for a long ride along the eastern shore. I went. The eastern shore is lovely in late March, and I was in no hurry to return. She told me what happened later, because she is straightforward, and there seemed to her to be no particular reason not to. He had found her in the library, of course the library, in the late afternoon light, with the drainage calculations spread across the table and her handwriting in the margins of his steward's letter. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment, she said, the way he sometimes did when he was composing something that required more words than his usual ration. Then he'd said, you know what my grandmother intended. She'd said, I suspected. And it doesn't trouble you. That she likes you very much and wants you to be less alone. No, it doesn't trouble me. He had come fully into the room then, she said, had stood at the near end of the table with his hands on the back of a chair and the light from the west windows on him, and he'd said, you would have found your way without her. You're not the kind of person who needs arranging. She'd looked at him. I'm a disgraced general's daughter with no money and no position and a very good understanding of Highland drainage systems, she said. I needed somewhere to be useful. Your grandmother offered me one. You've been useful, he said. You've also been more than that. There was a silence. She described it as the kind of silence that is not empty, that is, in fact, very full, and the filling of it is the whole point. What are you asking me, Carramore? She said. He let go of the chair. He looked at her the way she had first looked at him, directly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which between them, by then, it was. I'm asking whether you would consider staying, he said. Not as a companion. As the other thing, I recognize this is abrupt. I recognize you had no intention of this when you came here, and my grandmother gave you no warning of it, and I know I have been a great deal less easy to be around than I might have been. You've been fine, she said. I've been a recluse who talks about drainage. I like drainage, she said, and I like you, and yes. That was all. He crossed to where she was sitting and took her hand, just her hand, held carefully, in the manner of a man who has been alone a long time, and is not quite sure he deserves what he's been given. And she let him hold it, and the west windows went pink with the last of the March light, and the drainage calculations sat on the table between them like a very unlikely love letter. I found this out about it later, which is the lot of the friend, but what I found when I came back from the eastern shore that evening was a house that felt different, not dramatically different, not the ballroom and chandeliers different of a formal announcement, just warmer. The way a room is warmer when a fire has been burning in it for a while and the heat has reached the walls. The Dowager was at dinner, looking as though she had slept very well that afternoon and was immensely refreshed by it. Carramore was at the head of the table, in his usual chair, with the usual slight angle that kept him out of the direct light. Miss Reed was to his left, exactly as she'd been every evening for 3 weeks. The difference was that he poured her wine before she sat down, and then when she had sat, he said something quietly to her, too quietly for me to hear, and she looked at him for a moment and then said something back, and he almost smiled. Not almost. He smiled. A real one with actual warmth in it, the kind I had not seen on his face in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it. Lady Ainsley caught my eye across the table. She said nothing. She lifted her glass very slightly, in a gesture that I was quite certain was not meant for me at all, but that I witnessed anyway. I will tell you what happened in the weeks and months after, briefly, because the long arc of it is its own story. He announced the engagement formally in April, in a letter to his solicitor, and in a separate, longer letter to his grandmother's circle in London, which was received with the predictable mixture of surprise and quick recalculation that always greets such news when it involves a Duke of Carramore's standing, and someone society had quietly decided to discount. There were raised eyebrows. There were whispered remarks in drawing rooms. The name Reed, which had been a mark against her, became, with the peculiar alchemy of rank, something people found ways to qualify and eventually to reframe. Carramore paid none of this any attention whatsoever. He was not, as I have noted, a man who required outside confirmation. He wrote his letters, managed his estate, worked through the northern drainage project with a focus that the steward found both bracing and slightly alarming, and in the evenings he sat in the library with Elspeth Reed and they read, side by side, in the particular quiet of two people who have found that they take up exactly the right amount of space for each other. She stayed, of course she stayed. But not because she had no choice. She had by then been offered a very respectable companion position in Edinburgh, which she declined. She stayed because Dunlevy had become, in 3 weeks and 200 pages of drainage surveys, somewhere she wanted to be. She stayed because he had said the other thing, and she had meant yes. They were married in June, in the small stone chapel on the Dunlevy grounds, with the tenants in the near fields and the Highland Light doing what Highland Light does in June, which is to say everything. The Dowager Duchess wore her best gray silk and the expression of a woman who has executed a plan to perfection and is too well-bred to say so, which is its own kind of saying so. I stood beside Carramore, who was not anxious. He was never anxious. It was one of his most irritating qualities. But who was the particular still of a person paying very close attention, which is what he does when something matters to him. She came in on the arm of the estate steward, because there was no one else to ask, and she did it with the same upright, direct-eyed composure she had arrived with in March, except that there was a warmth in her face now, on top of the composure. a warmth that had not been there when she stepped out of that second carriage with her sensible bonnet and her own bag, not because she had been cold then, but because the warmth had been held in reserve, waiting for somewhere to put it. Carramore took her hand at the altar. He held it the same careful way he had held it in the library, that afternoon in March, as though the thing he'd been given was worth taking care of. The ceremony was short. Dunlevy is not a house that goes in for theater. Afterward in the courtyard I shook his hand and kissed hers, and the Dowager kissed them both with brisk efficiency and said to no one in particular, "I knew in the first 5 minutes," which was certainly true and also, I strongly suspected, an understatement. "You managed us," Carramore said to her, which was, from him, a statement of remarkable frankness. His grandmother looked at him with the full weight of 81 years of having been right about things. "Someone had to," she said. "You were both being very sensible." He looked at his wife. She looked at him. "We were," she agreed. He made a sound that was, I will swear to this, very nearly a laugh. "I will tell you one last thing, because it is the truest thing about all of it. 3 weeks after the wedding, I rode out with them along the lower Edaram fields, where the drainage work was finally complete. The cleared channel running for the first time in 40 years, the lower fields dry and green in the July light. Carramore walked the line of it with the steward, checking the cuts and the fall of the land, and Elspeth walked beside him, in her plain dress and her practical boots. Reading the slope of the field with the same quick eyes, she turned on the Dunlevy courtyard the first day she arrived. At one point she said something to him, pointed to a line in the field where the runoff would need a secondary cut to prevent a new accumulation. He looked. He asked the steward. The steward confirmed it. Carramore directed the change. He did not say she was right. He didn't need to. He'd been saying it quietly in every relevant way since the afternoon in the library when he'd looked at her across a table full of survey maps and realized that the woman his grandmother had sent to him was precisely the person the house had needed. And so, it turned out, had he. I thought walking back to the horses in the July sun of the Dowager's letter. 3 lines, her seal pressed deep. A woman of 81 with the patience of someone who has understood, for a very long time, that the right people placed in the right room will eventually stop being sensible about each other. She had been right, of course. She generally was. It was, in my experience, her single most reliable quality. And the Duke of Carramore, who had never in 33 years submitted to being managed, had been managed beautifully, into the warmest thing I have ever watched him be.